Excellent People, a short story by Anton Chekhov. Once upon a time, there lived in Moscow a man called Vladimir Semyonich Lyadovsky. He took his degree at the university in the Faculty of Law and had a post on the board of management of some railway. But if you had asked him what his work was, he would look candidly and openly at you with his large, bright eyes through his gold pince-nez and would answer in a soft, velvety, lisping baritone, "My work is literature." After completing his course at the university, Vladimir Semyonich had had a paragraph of theatrical criticism accepted by a newspaper. From this paragraph he passed on to reviewing, and a year later he had advanced to writing a weekly article on literary matters for the same paper. But it does not follow from these facts that he was an amateur, that his literary work was of an ephemeral, haphazard character. Whenever I saw his neat, spare figure, his high forehead and long mane of hair, when I listened to his speeches, it always seemed to me that his writing, quite apart from what and how he wrote, was something organically part of him, like the beating of his heart, and that his whole literary program must have been an integral part of his brain while he was a baby in his mother's womb. Even in his walk, his gestures, his manner of shaking off the ash from his cigarette, I could read this whole program from A to Z, with all its claptrap, dullness, and honourable sentiments. He was a literary man all over, when with an inspired face he laid a wreath on the coffin of some celebrity, or with a grave and solemn face collected signatures for some address. His passion for making the acquaintance of distinguished literary men, his faculty for finding talent even where it was absent, his perpetual enthusiasm, his pulse that went at 120 a minute, his ignorance of life, the genuinely feminine flutter with which he threw himself into concerts and literary evenings for the benefit of destitute students, the way in which he gravitated towards the young, all this would have created for him the reputation of a writer, even if he had not written his articles. He was one of those writers to whom phrases like, "We are but few," or "What would life be without strife?" "Forward," were preeminently becoming, though he never strove with anyone and never did go forward. It did not even sound mawkish when he fell to discoursing of ideals. Every anniversary of the university, on St. Tatiana's Day, he got drunk, chanted Gaudeamus out of tune, and his beaming and perspiring countenance seemed to say, "See, I'm drunk, I'm keeping it up." But even that suited him. Vladimir Semyonich had genuine faith in his literary vocation and his whole program. He had no doubts and was evidently very well pleased with himself. Only one thing grieved him. The paper for which he worked had a limited circulation and was not very influential. But Vladimir Semyonich believed that sooner or later he would succeed in getting onto a solid magazine where he would have scope and could display himself. And what little distress he felt on this score was pale beside the brilliance of his hopes. Visiting this charming man, I made the acquaintance of his sister, Vera Semyonovna, a woman doctor. At first sight, what struck me about this woman was her look of exhaustion and extreme ill health. She was young, with a good figure and regular, rather large features, but in comparison with her agile, elegant, and talkative brother, she seemed angular, listless, slovenly, and sullen. There was something strained, cold, apathetic in her movements, smiles, and words. She was not liked, and was thought proud, and not very intelligent. In reality, I fancy she was resting. "My dear friend," her brother would often say to me, sighing and flinging back his hair in his picturesque literary way, "one must never judge by appearances. Look at this book. It has long ago been read. It is warped, tattered, and lies in the dust uncared for. But open it, and it will make you weep and turn pale. My sister is like that book. Lift the cover and peep into her soul, and you will be horror-stricken." Vera passed in some 3 months through experiences that would have been ample for a whole lifetime. Vladimir Semyonich looked round him, took me by the sleeve, and began to whisper. "You know, after taking her degree, she married, for love, an architect. It's a complete tragedy. They had hardly been married a month when, woo, her husband died of typhus. But that was not all. She caught typhus from him, and when, on her recovery, she learnt that her Ivan was dead, she took a good dose of morphia. If it had not been for vigorous measures taken by her friends, my Vera would have been by now in paradise. Tell me, isn't it a tragedy? And is not my sister like an ingenue who has played already all the 5 acts of her life? The audience may stay for the farce, but the ingenue must go home to rest. After 3 months of misery, Vera Semyonovna had come to live with her brother. She was not fitted for the practice of medicine, which exhausted her and did not satisfy her. She did not give one the impression of knowing her subject, and I never once heard her say anything referring to her medical studies. She gave up medicine, and silent and unoccupied, as though she were a prisoner, spent the remainder of her youth in colourless apathy, with bowed head and hanging hands. The only thing to which she was not completely indifferent, and which brought some brightness into the twilight of her life, was the presence of her brother, whom she loved. She loved him himself and his programme. She was full of reverence for his articles. And when she was asked what her brother was doing, she would answer in a subdued voice as though afraid of waking or distracting him. "He is writing." Usually, when he was at his work, she used to sit beside him, her eyes fixed on his writing hand. She used at such moments to look like a sick animal warming itself in the sun. One winter evening, Vladimir Semyonich was sitting at his table writing a critical article for his newspaper. Vera Semyonovna was sitting beside him, staring as usual at his writing hand. The critic wrote rapidly, without erasures or corrections. The pen scratched and squeaked. On the table near the writing hand there lay open a freshly cut volume of a thick magazine containing a story of peasant life, signed with 2 initials. Vladimir Semyonich was enthusiastic. He thought the author was admirable in his handling of the subject, suggested Turgenev in his descriptions of nature, was truthful, and had an excellent knowledge of the life of the peasantry. The critic himself knew nothing of peasant life except from books and hearsay, but his feelings and his inner convictions forced him to believe the story. He foretold a brilliant future for the author, assured him he should await the conclusion of the story with great impatience, and so on. "Fine story," he said, flinging himself back in his chair and closing his eyes with pleasure. "The tone is extremely good." Vera Semyonovna looked at him, yawned aloud, and suddenly asked an unexpected question. In the evening, she had a habit of yawning nervously and asking short, abrupt questions, not always relevant. "Volodya," she asked, "what is the meaning of non-resistance to evil?" "Non-resistance to evil," repeated her brother, opening his eyes. "Yes. What do you understand by it?" "You see, my dear, imagine that thieves or brigands attack you, and you, instead of—" "No, give me a logical definition." "A logical definition? Well," Vladimir Semyonich pondered. "Non-resistance to evil means an attitude of non-interference with regard to all that in the sphere of mortality is called evil." Saying this, Vladimir Semyonich bent over the table and took up a novel. This novel, written by a woman, dealt with the painfulness of the irregular position of a society lady who was living under the same roof with her lover and her illegitimate child. Vladimir Semyonich was pleased with the excellent tendency of the story, the plot, and the presentation of it. Making a brief summary of the novel, he selected the best passages and added to them in his account. How true to reality, how living, how picturesque. The author is not merely an artist. He is also a subtle psychologist who can see into the hearts of his characters. Take, for example, this vivid description of the emotions of the heroine on meeting her husband, and so on. "Volodya," Vera Semyonovna interrupted his critical effusions, "I've been haunted by a strange idea since yesterday. I keep wondering where we should all be if human life were ordered on the basis of non-resistance to evil. In all probability, nowhere. Non-resistance to evil would give the full rein to the criminal will, and to say nothing of civilization, this would leave not one stone standing upon another anywhere on Earth. What would be left? Bashi Bazook and brothels. In my next article, I'll talk about that perhaps. Thank you for reminding me. And a week later, my friend kept his promise. That was just at the period, in the 80s, when people were beginning to talk and write of non-resistance, of the right to judge, to punish, to make war, when some people in our set were beginning to do without servants, to retire into the country, to work on the land, and to renounce animal food and carnal love. After reading her brother's article, Vera Semyonovna pondered and hardly perceptibly shrugged her shoulders. "Very nice," she said, "but still there's a great deal I don't understand. For instance, in Leskov's story, belonging to the cathedral, there is a queer gardener who sews for the benefit of all, for customers, for beggars, and any who care to steal. Did he behave sensibly?" From his sister's tone and expression, Vladimir Semyonich saw that she did not like his article, and, almost for the first time in his life, his vanity as an author sustained a shock. With a shade of irritation, he answered, "Theft is immoral. To sow for thieves is to recognize the right of thieves to existence. What would you think if I were to establish a newspaper and, dividing it into sections, provide for blackmailing as well as for liberal ideas? Following the example of that gardener, I ought logically to provide a section for blackmailers, the intellectual scoundrels. Yes." Vera Semyonovna made no answer. She got up from the table, moved languidly to the sofa, and lay down. "I don't know. I know nothing about it," she said, musingly. "You are probably right, but it seems to me, I feel somehow, that there's something false in our resistance to evil, as though there were something concealed or unsaid. God knows, perhaps our methods of resisting evil belong to the category of prejudices which have become so deeply rooted in us that we are incapable of parting with them, and therefore cannot form a correct judgment of them." "How do you mean?" "I don't know how to explain to you. Perhaps man is mistaken in thinking that he is obliged to resist evil and has a right to do so, just as he is mistaken in thinking, for instance, that the heart looks like an ace of hearts. It is very possible in resisting evil we ought not to use force, but to use what is the very opposite of force. If you, for instance, don't want this picture stolen from you, you ought to give it away rather than lock it up." "That's clever, very clever. If I want to marry a rich, vulgar woman, she ought to prevent me from such a shabby action by hastening to make me an offer herself." The brother and sister talked till midnight without understanding each other. If any outsider had overheard them, he would hardly have been able to make out what either of them was driving at. They usually spent the evening at home. There were no friends' houses to which they could go, and they felt no need for friends. They only went to the theatre when there was a new play. Such was the custom in literary circles. They did not go to concerts, for they did not care for music. "You may think what you like," Vera Semyonovna began again the next day. "But for me, the question is to a great extent settled. I am firmly convinced that I have no grounds for resisting evil directed against me personally. If they want to kill me, let them. My defending myself will not make the murderer better. All I have now to decide is the second half of the question, how I ought to behave to evil directed against my neighbors." "Vera, mind you don't become rabid," said Vladimir Semyonich, laughing. "I see non-resistance is becoming your idée fixe." He wanted to turn off these tedious conversations with a jest, but somehow it was beyond a jest. His smile was artificial and sour. His sister gave up sitting beside his table and gazing reverently at his writing hand, and he felt every evening that behind him on the sofa lay a person who did not agree with him. And his back grew stiff and numb, and there was a chill in his soul. An author's vanity is vindictive, implacable, incapable of forgiveness, and his sister was the first and only person who had laid bare and disturbed that uneasy feeling, which is like a big box of crockery, easy to unpack but impossible to pack up again, as it was before. Weeks and months passed by, and his sister clung to her ideas, and did not sit down by the table. One spring evening, Vladimir Semyonich was sitting at his table writing an article. He was reviewing a novel which described how a village schoolmistress refused the man whom she loved and who loved her, a man both wealthy and intellectual, simply because marriage made her work as a schoolmistress impossible. Vera Semyonovna lay on the sofa and brooded. "My God, how slow it is," she said, stretching. "How insipid and empty life is. I don't know what to do with myself, and you are wasting your best years in goodness knows what. Like some alchemist, you are rummaging in old rubbish that nobody wants. My God!" Vladimir Semyonich dropped his pen and slowly looked round at his sister. "It's depressing to look at you," said his sister. "Wagner in Faust dug up worms, but he was looking for a treasure anyway, and you are looking for worms for the sake of the worms. That's vague." "Yes, Volodya. All these days I've been thinking painfully for a long time, and I have come to the conclusion that you are hopelessly reactionary and conventional. Come, ask yourself what is the object of your zealous, conscientious work. Tell me, what is it? Why, everything has long ago been extracted that can be extracted from that rubbish in which you are always rummaging. You may pound water in a mortar and analyze it as long as you like. You'll make nothing more of it than the chemists have made already." "Indeed," drawled Vladimir Semyonich, getting up. "Yes, all this is old rubbish because these ideas are eternal. But what do you consider new, then? You undertake to work in the domain of thought. It is for you to think of something new. It's not for me to teach you." "Me, an alchemist!" the critic cried in wonder and indignation, screwing up his eyes ironically. "Art, progress, all that is alchemy. You see, Volodya, it seems to me that if all you thinking people had set yourselves to solving great problems, all these little questions that you fuss about now would solve themselves by the way. If you go up in a balloon to see a town, you will incidentally, without any effort, see the fields and the villages and the rivers as well. When stearine is manufactured, you get glycerine as a byproduct. It seems to me that contemporary thought has settled on one spot and stuck to it. It is prejudiced, apathetic, timid, afraid to take a wide, titanic flight, just as you and I are afraid to climb on a high mountain. It is conservative. Such conversations could not but leave traces. The relations of the brother and sister grew more and more strained every day. The brother became unable to work in his sister's presence and grew irritable when he knew his sister was lying on the sofa looking at his back, while the sister frowned nervously and stretched when, trying to bring back the past, he attempted to share his enthusiasms with her. Every evening she complained of being bored and talked about independence of mind and those who are in the rut of tradition. Carried away by her new ideas, Vera Semyonovna proved that the work that her brother was so engrossed in was conventional, that it was a vain effort of conservative minds to preserve what had already served its turn and was vanishing from the scene of action. She made no end of comparisons. She compared her brother at one time to an alchemist, then to a musty old believer who would sooner die than listen to reason. By degrees there was a perceptible change in her manner of life too. She was capable of lying on the sofa all day long doing nothing but think, while her face wore a cold, dry expression such as one sees in one-sided people of strong faith. She began to refuse the attentions of the servants, swept and tidied her own room, cleaned her own boots and brushed her own clothes. Her brother could not help looking with irritation and even hatred at her cold face when she went about her menial work. In that work, which was always performed with a certain solemnity, he saw something strained and false. He saw something both pharisaical and affected. And knowing he could not touch her by persuasion, he carped at her and teased her like a schoolboy. "You won't resist evil, but you resist my having servants," he taunted her. "If servants are an evil, why do you oppose it? That's inconsistent." He suffered, was indignant, and even ashamed. He felt ashamed when his sister began doing odd things before strangers. "It's awful, my dear fellow," he said to me in private, waving his hands in despair. It seems that our ingenue has remained to play a part in the farce too. She's become morbid to the marrow of her bones. I've washed my hands of her, let her think as she likes. But why does she talk? Why does she excite me? She ought to think what it means for me to listen to her. What I feel when in my presence she has the effrontery to support her errors by blasphemously quoting the teaching of Christ. It chokes me. It makes me hot all over to hear my sister propounding her doctrines and trying to distort the gospel to suit her, when she purposely refrains from mentioning how the money changers were driven out of the temple. That's, my dear fellow, what comes of being half-educated, undeveloped. That's what comes of medical studies, which provide no general culture. One day, on coming home from the office, Vladimir Semyonich found his sister crying. She was sitting on the sofa with her head bowed, wringing her hands, and tears were flowing freely down her cheeks. The critic's good heart throbbed with pain. Tears fell from his eyes, too, and he longed to pet his sister, to forgive her, to beg her forgiveness, and to live as they used to before. He knelt down and kissed her head, her hands, her shoulders. She smiled, smiled bitterly, unaccountably, while he, with a cry of joy, jumped up, seized the magazine from the table, and said warmly, "Hurrah! We'll live as we used to, Verochka, with God's blessing, and I've such a surprise for you here. Instead of celebrating the occasion with champagne, let us read it together. A splendid, wonderful thing." "Oh, no, no," cried Vera Semyonovna, pushing away the book in alarm. "I've read it already. I don't want it. I don't want it." "When did you read it?" "A year, 2 years ago. I read it long ago, and I know it. I know it." "You're a fanatic," her brother said coldly, flinging the magazine onto the table. "No, you are a fanatic, not I. You!" And Vera Semyonovna dissolved into tears again. Her brother stood before her, looked at her quivering shoulders, and thought. He thought not of the agonies of loneliness endured by anyone who begins to think in a new way of their own, not of the inevitable sufferings of a genuine spiritual revolution, but of the outrage of his program, the outrage to his author's vanity. From this time, he treated his sister coldly, with careless irony, and he endured her presence in the room as one endures the presence of old women that are dependent on one. For her part, she left off disputing with him, and met all his arguments, jeers, and attacks with a condescending silence which irritated him more than ever. One summer morning, Vera Semyonovna, dressed for travelling with a satchel over her shoulder, went in to her brother and coldly kissed him on the forehead. "Where are you going?" he asked with surprise. "To the province of N to do vaccination work." Her brother went out into the street with her. "So that's what you've decided upon, you queer girl," he muttered. "Don't you want some money?" "No, thank you. Goodbye." The sister shook her brother's hand and set off. "Why don't you have a cab?" cried Vladimir Semyonich. She did not answer. Her brother gazed after her, watched her rusty-looking waterproof, the swaying of her figure as she slouched along, forced himself to sigh, but did not succeed in rousing a feeling of regret. His sister had become a stranger to him, and he was a stranger to her. Anyway, she did not once look round. Going back to his room, Vladimir Semyonich at once sat down to the table and began to work at his article. I never saw Vera Semyonovna again. Where she is now, I do not know. And Vladimir Semyonich went on writing his articles, laying wreaths on coffins, singing Gaudeamus, busying himself over the Mutual Aid Society of Moscow journalists. He fell ill with inflammation of the lungs. He was ill in bed for 3 months, at first at home and afterwards in the Golitsyn hospital. An abscess developed in his knee. People said he ought to be sent to the Crimea and began getting up a collection for him. But he did not go to the Crimea. He died. We buried him in the Vagankovsky cemetery on the left side, where artists and literary men are buried. One day, we writers were sitting in the Tatars' restaurant. I mentioned that I had lately been in the Vagankovsky cemetery and had seen Vladimir Semyonich's grave there. It was utterly neglected and almost indistinguishable from the rest of the ground. The cross had fallen. It was necessary to collect a few rubles to put it in order, but they listened to what I said unconcernedly, made no answer, and I could not collect a farthing. No one remembered Vladimir Semyonich. He was utterly forgotten. A Blunder. A short story by Anton Chekhov. Ilya Sergeyevich. Peplov and his wife, Cleopatra Petrovna, were standing at the door, listening greedily. On the other side, in the little drawing room, a love scene was apparently taking place between two persons, their daughter Natashenka and a teacher of the district school called Shupkin. "He's rising," whispered Peplov, quivering with impatience and rubbing his hands. "Now, Cleopatra, mind, as soon as they begin talking of their feelings, take down the icon from the wall and we'll go in and bless them. We'll catch him. A blessing with an icon is sacred and binding. He couldn't get out of it if he brought it into court." On the other side of the door, this was the conversation. "Don't go on like that," said Shupkin, striking a match against his checked trousers. "I never wrote you any letters." "I like that, as though I didn't know your writing," giggled the girl with an affected shriek, continually peeping at herself in the glass. "I knew it at once. And what a queer man you are. You are a writing master, and you write like a spider. How can you teach writing if you write so badly yourself?" That means nothing. The great thing in writing lessons is not the hand one writes, but keeping the boys in order. You hit one on the head with a ruler, make another kneel down. Besides, there's nothing in handwriting. Nekrasov was an author, but his handwriting's a disgrace. There's a specimen of it in his collected works. You are not Nekrasov. A sigh. I should love to marry an author. He'd always be writing poems to me. I can write you a poem too, if you like. What can you write about? Love, passion, your eyes. You'll be crazy when you read it. It would draw a tear from a stone. And if I write you a real poem, will you let me kiss your hand? That's nothing much. You can kiss it now if you like. Shupkin jumped up and, making sheepish eyes, bent over the fat little hand that smelt of egg soap. "Take down the icon," Peplov whispered in a fluster, pale with excitement, and buttoning his coat as he prodded his wife with his elbow. "Come along, now." And without a second's delay, Peplov flung open the door. "Children," he muttered, lifting up his arms and blinking tearfully. "The Lord bless you, my children. May you live, be fruitful, and multiply." And I bless you too," the mama brought out, crying with happiness. "May you be happy, my dear ones. Oh, you are taking from me my only treasure," she said to Shupkin. "Love my girl. Be good to her." Shupkin's mouth fell open with amazement and alarm. The parents' attack was so bold and unexpected that he could not utter a single word. "I'm in for it. I'm spliced," he thought, going limp with horror. "It's all over with you now, my boy. There's no escape." And he bowed his head submissively, as though to say, "Take me, I'm vanquished." "Blessings on you," the papa went on, and he, too, shed tears. "Natashenka, my daughter, stand by his side. Cleopatra, give me the icon." But at this point, the father suddenly left off weeping, and his face was contorted with anger. "You ninny," he said angrily to his wife. "You are an idiot. Is that the icon?" Ah, saints alive! What had happened? The writing master raised himself and saw that he was saved. In her flutter, the mamma had snatched from the wall the portrait of Vladchechnikov, the author, in mistake for the icon. Old Peploff and his wife stood disconcerted in the middle of the room, holding the portrait aloft, not knowing what to do or what to say. The writing master took advantage of the general confusion and slipped away. From the Diary of a Violent-Tempered Man, a short story by Anton Chekhov. I am a serious person, and my mind is of a philosophic bent. My vocation is the study of finance. I am a student of financial law, and I have chosen as the subject of my dissertation the past and future of the dog license. I need hardly point out that young ladies, songs, moonlight, and all that sort of silliness are entirely out of my line. Morning, 10 o'clock. My maman pours me out a cup of coffee. I drink it and go out on the little balcony to set to work on my dissertation. I take a clean sheet of paper, dip the pen into the ink, and write out the title, The Past and Future of the Dog License. After thinking a little, I write, Historical Survey. We may deduce from some allusions in Herodotus and Xenophon that the origin of the tax on dogs goes back to... But at that point, I hear footsteps that strike me as highly suspicious. I look down from the balcony and see below a young lady with a long face and a long waist. Her name, I believe, is Nadenka or Varenka. It really does not matter which. She is looking for something, pretends not to have noticed me, and is humming to herself. Dost thou remember that song full of tenderness? I read through what I have written and want to continue, but the young lady pretends to have just caught sight of me and says in a mournful voice, Good morning, Nikolai Andreich. Only fancy what a misfortune I have had. I went for a walk yesterday and lost the little ball off my bracelet. I read through once more the opening of my dissertation. I trim up the tail of the letter G and mean to go on, but the young lady persists. Nikolai Andreich, she says, won't you see me home? The Karolins have such a huge dog that I simply daren't pass it alone. There is no getting out of it. I lay down my pen and go down to her. Nadenka, or Varenka, takes my arm, and we set off in the direction of her villa. When the duty of walking arm in arm with a lady falls to my lot, for some reason or other, I always feel like a peg with a heavy cloak hanging on it. Nadenka, or Varenka, between ourselves, of an ardent temperament, her grandfather was an Armenian, has a peculiar art of throwing her whole weight on one's arm and clinging to one's side like a leech. And so we walk along. As we pass the Karolins, I see a huge dog who reminds me of the dog license. I think with despair of the work I have begun and sigh. What are you sighing for? Asks Nadenka, or Varenka, and heaves a sigh herself. Here I must digress for a moment to explain that Nadenka, or Varenka, now I come to think of it, I believe I have heard her called Mashenka, imagines, I can't guess why, that I am in love with her, and therefore thinks it her duty as a humane person always to look at me with compassion and to soothe my wound with words. Listen, said she, stopping. I know why you are sighing. You are in love, yes, but I beg you for the sake of our friendship to believe that the girl you love has the deepest respect for you. She cannot return your love, but is it her fault that her heart has long been another's? Mashenka's nose begins to swell and turn red, her eyes fill with tears. She evidently expects some answer from me, but fortunately, at this moment, we arrive. Mashenka's mamma, a good-natured woman but full of conventional ideas, is sitting on the terrace. Glancing at her daughter's agitated face, she looks intently at me and sighs as though saying to herself, Ah, these young people. They don't even know how to keep their secrets to themselves. On the terrace with her are several young ladies of various colours and a retired officer who is staying in the villa next to ours. He was wounded during the last war in the left temple and the right hip. This unfortunate man is, like myself, proposing to devote the summer to literary work. He is writing the memoirs of a military man. Like me, he begins his honorable labors every morning, but before he has written more than I was born in. Some Varenka or Mashenka is sure to appear under his balcony, and the wounded hero is borne off under guard. All the party sitting on the terrace are engaged in preparing some miserable fruit for jam. I make my bows and am about to beat a retreat, but the young ladies of various colours seize my hat with a squeal and insist on my staying. I sit down. They give me a plate of fruit and a hairpin. I begin taking the seeds out. The young ladies of various colours talk about men. They say that so-and-so is nice-looking, that so-and-so is handsome but not nice, that somebody else is nice but ugly, and that a fourth would not have been bad-looking if his nose were not like a thimble, and so on. "And you, Monsieur Nicolas," says Varenka's mamma, turning to me, "are not handsome, but you are attractive. There is something about your face. In men, though, it's not beauty, but intelligence that matters," she adds, sighing. The young ladies sigh, too, and drop their eyes. They agree that the great thing in men is not beauty, but intelligence. I steal a glance sideways at a looking-glass to ascertain whether I really am attractive. I see a shaggy head, a bushy beard, moustaches, eyebrows, hair on my cheeks, hair up to my eyes, a perfect thicket with a solid nose sticking up out of it like a watchtower. Attractive. But it's by the qualities of your soul, after all, that you will make your way, Nicholas, sighs Nadenka's mamma, as though affirming some secret and original idea of her own. And Nadenka is sympathetically distressed on my account, but the conviction that a man passionately in love with her is sitting opposite is obviously a source of the greatest enjoyment to her. When they have done with men, the young ladies begin talking about love. After a long conversation about love, one of the young ladies gets up and goes away. Those that remain begin to pick her to pieces. Everyone agrees that she is stupid, unbearable, ugly, and that one of her shoulder blades sticks out in a shocking way. But at last, thank goodness, I see our maid. My maman has sent her to call me in to dinner. Now I can make my escape from this uncongenial company and go back to my work. I get up and make my bows. Varenka's maman, Varenka herself, and the variegated young ladies surround me and declare that I cannot possibly go, because I promised yesterday to dine with them and go to the woods to look for mushrooms. I bow and sit down again. My soul is boiling with rage, and I feel that in another moment I may not be able to answer for myself, that there may be an explosion, but gentlemanly feeling and the fear of committing a breach of good manners compels me to obey the ladies, and I obey them. We sit down to dinner. The wounded officer, whose wound in the temple has affected the muscles of the left cheek, eats as though he had a bit in his mouth. I roll up little balls of bread, think about the dog license, and knowing the ungovernable violence of my temper, try to avoid speaking. Nadenka looks at me sympathetically. Soup, tongue and peas, roast fowl and compote. I have no appetite, but eat from politeness. After dinner, while I am standing alone on the terrace, smoking, Nadenka's mamma comes up to me, presses my hand and says breathlessly, "Don't despair, Nicholas. She has such a heart, such a heart." We go towards the wood to gather mushrooms. Varenka hangs on my arm and clings to my side. My sufferings are indescribable, but I bear them in patience. We enter the wood. "Listen, Monsieur Nicolas," says Nadenka, sighing. "Why are you so melancholy, and why are you so silent? Extraordinary girl she is, really. What can I talk to her about? What have we in common?" "Oh, do say something," she begs me. I begin trying to think of something popular, something within the range of her understanding. After a moment's thought, I say, "The cutting down of forests has been greatly detrimental to the prosperity of Russia." "Nicholas," sighs Nadenka, and her nose begins to turn red. "Nicholas, I see you are trying to avoid being open with me. You seem to wish to punish me by your silence. Your feeling is not returned, and you wish to suffer in silence, in solitude." "It is too awful, Nicholas," she cries impulsively, seizing my hand, and I see her nose beginning to swell. What would you say if the girl you love were to offer you her eternal friendship? I mutter something incoherent, for I really can't think what to say to her. In the first place, I'm not in love with any girl at all. In the second, what could I possibly want her eternal friendship for? And thirdly, I have a violent temper. Mashenka, or Varenka, hides her face in her hands and murmurs as though to herself, "He will not speak. It is clear that he will have me make the sacrifice. I cannot love him if my heart is still another's. But I will think of it. Very good. I will think of it. I will prove the strength of my soul, and perhaps, at the cost of my own happiness, I will save this man from suffering. I can make nothing out of all this. It seems some special sort of puzzle. We go farther into the wood and begin picking mushrooms. We are perfectly silent the whole time. Nadenka's face shows signs of inward struggle. I hear the bark of dogs. It reminds me of my dissertation, and I sigh heavily. Between the trees, I catch sight of the wounded officer limping painfully along. The poor fellow's right leg is lame from his wound, and on his left arm he has one of the variegated young ladies. His face expresses resignation to destiny. We go back to the house to drink tea, after which we play croquet and listen to one of the variegated young ladies singing a song, "No, no, thou lovest not, no, no." At the word "no," she twists her mouth till it almost touches one ear. "Charmant!" wail the other young ladies. "Charmant!" The evening comes on. A detestable moon creeps up behind the bushes. There is perfect stillness in the air, and an unpleasant smell of freshly cut hay. I take up my hat and try to get away. "I have something I must say to you," Mashenka whispers to me significantly. "Don't go away." I have a foreboding of evil, but politeness obliges me to remain. Mashenka takes my arm and leads me away to a garden walk. By this time, her whole figure expresses conflict. She is pale and gasping for breath, and she seems absolutely set on pulling my right arm out of the socket. What can be the matter with her? "Listen," she mutters. "No, I cannot. No." She tries to say something, but hesitates. Now I see from her face that she has come to some decision. With gleaming eyes and swollen nose, she snatches my hand and says hurriedly, "Nicholas, I am yours. Love you I cannot, but I promise to be true to you." Then she squeezes herself to my breast and at once springs away. "Someone is coming," she whispers. "Farewell. Tomorrow at 11 o'clock I will be in the arbor. Farewell." And she vanishes. Completely at a loss for an explanation of her conduct and suffering from a painful palpitation of the heart, I make my way home. There, the past and future of the dog license is awaiting me, but I am quite unable to work. I am furious. I may say my anger is terrible. Damn it all! I allow no one to treat me like a boy. I'm a man of violent temper, and it is not safe to trifle with me. When the maid comes in to call me to supper, I shout to her, "Go out of the room." Such hastiness augurs nothing good. Next morning, typical holiday weather, temperature below freezing, a cutting wind, rain, mud, and a smell of naphthalene, because my maman has taken all her wraps out of her trunks. A devilish morning. It is the 7th of August, 1887, the date of the solar eclipse. I may here remark that at the time of an eclipse, every one of us may, without special astronomical knowledge, be of the greatest service. Thus, for example, any one of us can, 1. Take the measurement of the diameters of the sun and the moon, 2. Sketch the corona of the sun, 3. Take the temperature, 4. Take observations of plants and animals during the eclipse, 5. Note down his own impressions, and so on. It is a matter of such exceptional importance that I lay aside the past and future of the dog license and make up my mind to observe the eclipse. We all get up very early, and I divide the work as follows. I am to measure the diameter of the sun and moon. The wounded officer is to sketch the corona, and the other observations are undertaken by Mashenka, and the variegated young ladies. We all meet together and wait. "What is the cause of the eclipse?" asks Mashenka. I reply, "A solar eclipse occurs when the moon, moving in the plane of the ecliptic, crosses the line joining the centers of the sun and the earth." "And what does the ecliptic mean?" I explain. Mashenka listens attentively. "Can one see through the smoked glass the line joining the centers of the sun and the earth?" she inquires. I reply that this is only an imaginary line, drawn theoretically. "If it is only an imaginary line, how can the moon cross it?" Varenka says, wondering. I make no reply. I feel my spleen rising at this naive question. "It's all nonsense," says Mashenka's mumble. "Impossible to tell what's going to happen. You've never been in the sky, so what can you know of what is to happen with the sun and moon? It's all fancy." At that moment, a black patch begins to move over the sun. General confusion follows. The sheep and horses and cows run bellowing about the fields with their tails in the air. The dogs howl. The bugs, thinking night has come on, creep out of the cracks in the walls and bite the people who are still in bed. The deacon, who was engaged in bringing some cucumbers from the market garden, jumped out of his cart and hid under the bridge, while his horse walked off into somebody else's yard, where the pigs ate up all the cucumbers. The excise officer, who had not slept at home that night, but at a lady friend's, dashed out with nothing on but his nightshirt, and running into the crowd, shouted frantically, "Save yourself if you can." Numbers of the lady visitors, even young and pretty ones, run out of their villas without even putting their slippers on. Scenes occur which I hesitate to describe. "Oh, how dreadful!" shriek the variegated young ladies. "It's really too awful." "Mesdames, watch!" I cry. "Time is precious." And I hasten to measure the diameters. I remember the corona and look towards the wounded officer. He stands doing nothing. "What's the matter?" I shout. "How about the corona?" He shrugs his shoulders and looks helplessly towards his arms. The poor fellow has variegated young ladies on both sides of him, clinging to him in terror and preventing him from working. I seize a pencil and note down the time to a second. That is of great importance. I note down the geographical position of the point of observation. That, too, is of importance. I am just about to measure the diameter when Mashenka seizes my hand and says, "Do not forget today, 11 o'clock." I withdraw my hand, feeling every second precious, try to continue my observations, but Varenka clutches my arm and clings to me. Pencil, pieces of glass, drawings, all are scattered on the grass. "Hang it!" It's high time the girl realized that I'm a man of violent temper, and when I am roused, my fury knows no bounds. I cannot answer for myself. I try to continue, but the eclipse is over. "Look at me," she whispers tenderly. Oh, that is the last straw. Trying a man's patience like that can but have a fatal ending. I am not to blame if something terrible happens. I allow no one to make a laughing stock of me, and God knows, when I am furious, I advise nobody to come near me, damn it all. There's nothing I might not do. One of the young ladies, probably noticing from my face what a rage I am in and anxious to propitiate me, says, "I did exactly what you told me, Nikolai Andreich. I watched the animals. I saw the grey dog chasing the cat just before the eclipse and wagging his tail for a long while afterwards. So nothing came of the eclipse after all. I go home. Thanks to the rain, I work indoors instead of on the balcony. The wounded officer has risked it and has again got as far as 'I was born in,' when I see one of the variegated young ladies pounce down on him and bear him off to her villa. I cannot work, for I am still in a fury and suffering from palpitation of the heart. I do not go to the arbor. It is impolite not to, but after all, I can't be expected to go in the rain. At 12 o'clock, I receive a letter from Mashenka, a letter full of reproaches and entreaties to go to the arbor, addressing me as thou. At 1 o'clock, I get a second letter, and at 2, a third. I must go. But before going, I must consider what I am to say to her. I will behave like a gentleman. To begin with, I will tell her that she is mistaken in supposing that I am in love with her. That's a thing one does not say to a lady as a rule, though. To tell a lady that one's not in love with her is almost as rude as to tell an author he can't write. The best thing will be to explain my views of marriage. I put on my winter overcoat, take an umbrella, and walk to the arbor. Knowing the hastiness of my temper, I am afraid I may be led into speaking too strongly. I will try to restrain myself. I find Nadenka still waiting for me. She is pale and in tears. On seeing me, she utters a cry of joy, flings herself on my neck, and says, "At last! You are trying my patience. Listen, I have not slept all night. I have been thinking and thinking. I believe that when I come to know you better, I shall learn to love you." I sit down and begin to unfold my views of marriage. To begin with, to clear the ground of digressions and to be as brief as possible, I open with a short historical survey. I speak of marriage in ancient Egypt and India, then pass to more recent times, a few ideas from Schopenhauer. Mashenka listens attentively, but all of a sudden, through some strange incoherence of ideas, thinks fit to interrupt me. "Nicola, kiss me," she says. I am embarrassed and don't know what to say to her. She repeats her request. There seems no avoiding it. I get up and bend over her long face, feeling as I do so just as I did in my childhood when I was lifted up to kiss my grandmother in her coffin. Not content with the kiss, Mashenka leaps up and impulsively embraces me. At that instant, Mashenka's maman appears in the doorway of the arbor. She makes a face as though in alarm and saying, "Shh," to someone with her, vanishes like Mephistopheles through the trapdoor. Confused and enraged, I return to our villa. At home, I find Varenka's maman embracing, my maman with tears in her eyes. And my maman weeps and says, "I always hoped for it." And then, if you please, Nadenka's maman comes up to me, embraces me and says, "May God bless you. Mind you love her well. Remember the sacrifice she is making for your sake." And here I am at my wedding. At the moment I write these last words, my best man is at my side, urging me to make haste. These people have no idea of my character. I have a violent temper. I cannot always answer for myself. Hang it all! God knows what will come of it. To lead a violent, desperate man to the altar is as unwise as to thrust one's hand into the cage of a ferocious tiger. We shall see. We shall see. And so I am married. Everybody congratulates me, and Varenka keeps clinging to me and saying, "Now you are mine, mine. Do you understand that? Tell me that you love me." And her nose swells as she says it. I learn from my best man that the wounded officer has very cleverly escaped the snares of Hymen. He showed the variegated young lady a medical certificate that, owing to the wound in his temple, he was at times mentally deranged and incapable of contracting a valid marriage. An inspiration. I might have got a certificate, too. An uncle of mine drank himself to death. Another uncle was extremely absent-minded. On one occasion he put a lady's muff on his head in mistake for his hat. An aunt of mine played a great deal on the piano and used to put out her tongue at gentlemen she did not like. My ungovernable temper is a very suspicious symptom. But why do these great ideas always come too late? Why?